Welcome to part 4 of the DevBytes series, Making Apps Beautiful. Thus far, we've managed to make our app look beautiful on modern phones and tablets, but we haven't really looked at the performance aspect. Having a beautiful app is more than just how it looks when it's not moving or animating. It's about also making sure that it's smooth and jank-free. So from a performance tuning point of view, what I'd like to do is profile my device on the lowest common denominator, which is exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to use a Nexus S running Android 2.3, fondly known as Gingerbread. So let's switch over to our Nexus S and see what our app looks like in its current state. Bomb. It crashed. Now, we're going to switch back to the slides and see why. The reality of it is that we're loading these high-resolution meat images and then displaying them as thumbnails. So we're actually exhausting the memory on the Nexus S much sooner than we would on our more modern devices, and it would have even happened with those ones if we had more images. So let's now switch to the code and see how we can better optimize this. What we're going to do is load these images at the resolution that we're going to display them, rather than the resolution that their source resolution. So we use this bitmap factory options object, and we then set this in just decode bounds to true. What that does is that it makes sure that decode resources only looks at the metadata of that bitmap, and in this case, the resolution. So once we've loaded that, we're going to go into our own method called calculate in sample size. We're going to try and calculate what the value of this should be. Basically, in sample size is a value that's used like a power of 2. So in sample size of 1 will mean we load the image in its native resolution or source resolution. 2 will mean it'll be halved horizontally and halved vertically. So it'll be a quarter of the size of the original image. So we just basically use some basic arithmetics here to work out, based on the source resolution of the image versus the display or required resolution, and then based on that ratio we return this in sample size from this method. So scrolling back up, we've calculated our in sample size, passed it to our bitmap factory options. We then need to remember to set in just decode bounds to false, and then go ahead and load the bitmap with our options. So now that we've optimized it and we're loading these bitmaps in the resolution that we need them in, let's go see what it looks like on the Nexus S. Shouldn't crash this time. And there we go, it launched, and we can see the app's running. But it's not running great. As we scroll here, you can see that we're getting some jitter and jank. So let's look at how we can optimize this, and let's switch over to our slides once again. The reason that we're getting this jank is that we're loading those images in the main thread, in the UI thread, and we really shouldn't do that. We should be doing these in a background thread, and our friend, the async task object class, is going to help us. So let's switch over to some code again, and we'll see here we've got an async task for loading our bitmap. We actually pass the image view to this async task, and we store it as a weak reference so that if the framework needs to free that image view, we're not going to hold on to it, and we're going to allow it to be garbage collected. Anyways, going to the doInBackground method on our async task, this is happening in a background thread, so we'll go ahead and actually load our sampled bitmap, and this is that code that we saw earlier, so it will kick in with those optimizations. Once this is done, in onPostExecute, we're just going to go ahead and apply the bitmap. So now let's see how the app looks like when we run it on our Nexus S. Great. We can see here that as we scroll, the images get loaded in. Now, because we're doing it in the background, what happens is that we get this placeholder. We're just using it's just an empty image there until the image loads, but it's happening in the background, and the important thing is that our scrolling is now smooth. But we have a new problem now. Every time an image goes off the screen, we're actually relinquishing that image, we're freeing it, and then loading it back in. That's not a very good thing to do. So what we're going to look at is how to fix that. So switching back to the slides, what we're going to do is we're going to use an image cache. Now what an image cache does is holds onto the images, so we'll load the image and then we'll throw it into the image cache, and it'll hold onto the images for as long as it can, and then when we go to request an image, we're going to look in the image cache first. So let's switch over to code, and in the onCreate method of our fragment, what we're going to do is initialize our LRU cache. That's the image cache we're going to use. But for the cache size, what we're going to do is we're going to set the cache size based on the maximum available memory on the device for our app in kilobytes, so dividing it by 1024. But we're actually going to get 1/8 of that size. So our cache will be 1/8 of the available memory in kilobytes, and that's what we'll use to initialize our LRU cache. Also keep in mind that we're overriding the size of method so that we can tell the cache how big our bitmaps are going to be. And that's it. With that, let's see what our Nexus S looks like now. So we're going to launch it. We expect it to be nice and smooth, which it is. And what we're seeing here is that as the images go off the screen, they're not actually being relinquished. Our cache is kicking in. Of course, if we blew our memory limit, it would start to dispose and throw away of those images and load them as necessary. But we don't need to in this situation. So we've reached the end of this DevByte. Let's switch over to the slides. This is where we started on the left-hand side with an outdated-looking app. It now looks beautiful and modern on modern devices. It runs really well. But one thing we haven't looked at yet is how to make it look equally beautiful on older devices. And we're going to do that in the next episode.